Why you wouldn't survive food in the time of Jesus for even 3 days. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the Sea of Galilee at dawn. The fishing boats return laden with the night's catch. The smell of fresh bread mingles with the scent of olive oil in the narrow streets of Capernaum. In your mind, you see Jesus breaking bread with his disciples. Simple, but pure food, blessed by divine hands. This romantic image, painted by centuries of religious art and Hollywood films, conceals a brutal truth. If you were transported to first-century Judea without preparation, you wouldn't die from Roman persecution or desert heat. You would die from what you ate. And here lie 3 questions that will challenge everything you thought you knew. What made the bread Jesus multiplied so different from what we eat today? Why did a simple meal in that era contain invisible threats capable of killing a modern human in 72 hours? And most disturbing of all, how did the Jewish people survive under conditions that would hospitalize us within days? Stay until the end, because what you're about to discover will not only change how you read the Gospels, but will reveal how divine providence operated through the smallest details of daily life in biblical times. To understand the mortal danger hidden in the food of Jesus' time, we must first immerse ourselves in a world radically different from ours. First-century Judea was not the pastoral paradise depicted in Sunday school illustrations. It was a land under Roman military occupation, where 90% of the population lived in crushing poverty. The average Galilean peasant survived on less than 800 calories per day, barely enough to sustain life with hard physical labor. The heat was relentless. In summer, temperatures in the Jordan Valley exceeded 110 degrees Celsius in the shade. There was no refrigeration, no running water, no understanding of bacteria. Food preservation was a daily battle against decomposition, and that battle was often lost. The smell that permeated first-century villages would be unbearable to our sanitized nostrils. A mixture of human waste used as fertilizer, rotting fish remains, rancid olive oil, and the ever-present dust that coated everything, including food. The social structure was feudal and brutal. A small elite of priests, landowners, and Roman collaborators consumed imported delicacies: wine from Italy, garum, fermented fish sauce from Spain, honey from Greece. Meanwhile, the masses survived on what biblical scholars call the Mediterranean triad: grain, olive oil, and wine. But even this triad, which sounds wholesome to modern ears, concealed deadly threats that our pampered immune systems could never withstand. Let's begin with bread, the very foundation of existence in Jesus' time. When the Gospels speak of daily bread, they are not being poetic. They are describing biological survival. Bread provided up to 70% of daily calories for the average person, but this was not the fluffy uniform product you buy at the supermarket. This was coarse, heavy bread made from barley or wheat that grew in fields fertilized with human and animal excrement. The grain itself was the first threat. Unlike modern wheat, which is carefully selected and stored in climate-controlled silos, first-century grain was stored in underground pits or clay jars where moisture was constant. In these dark, damp conditions, a deadly fungus thrived, ergot, particularly common in rye but also found in wheat and barley. This black parasitic growth produced powerful alkaloids, natural LSD compounds that medieval Europeans would later call St. Anthony's fire. A modern person eating bread contaminated with ergot would experience symptoms within hours: burning sensations in the extremities, violent hallucinations, convulsions, and in severe cases, gangrene as blood vessels constricted until fingers and toes turned black and fell off. Your nervous system, which has zero evolutionary tolerance for these mycotoxins, would begin failing catastrophically. But here's what's truly terrifying. In Jesus' time, there was no way to completely remove ergot from grain. It looked similar to the kernels themselves, and in times of famine, desperate families ground everything together. Even if the grain was ergot-free, the milling process introduced new dangers. Most families didn't own a millstone. These were communal property or owned by wealthy landowners who charged exorbitant fees. The alternative was hand grinding with a stone mortar, a process so labor-intensive that it literally ground stone dust into the flour. Archaeological analysis of teeth from this period shows extreme wear patterns from consuming bread filled with tiny stone particles. But stone dust was the least of your worries. In times of scarcity, and these were frequent under Roman taxation that took up to 40% of a peasant's harvest, flour was stretched with adulterants. Unscrupulous bakers or desperate housewives added sawdust, ground acorns, crushed legumes, even chalk and clay to increase volume. Your modern gastrointestinal tract, conditioned for easily digestible refined flours, would react to these indigestible materials with severe inflammation, bloody diarrhea, and potentially fatal bowel obstructions. A blocked intestine meant certain death. There was no surgery, no emergency room, only agony. And we haven't even discussed the most common danger, contamination during preparation. Bread dough was kneaded by unwashed hands in rooms where chickens wandered freely and flies congregated. The fermentation process, using a piece of old dough as sourdough starter, could harbor not just beneficial yeasts, but harmful bacteria like Clostridium perfringens, which causes severe food poisoning. But there was a bigger problem lurking in the very water used to make the dough. Water in 1st century Judea was perhaps the single most dangerous substance a modern person could consume. The romantic notion that everyone drank wine is partially true, but not because wine was abundant. It was because water was deadly. Rivers like the Jordan served multiple purposes simultaneously: drinking source, irrigation channel, washing station, and de facto sewer. Villages had no concept of water treatment. Human waste, animal carcasses, and industrial runoff from tanneries, which used urine and caustic chemicals, all flowed into the same streams people drew water from. The microbiological reality was apocalyptic. A single cup of water from a village well contained millions of fecal coliform bacteria, along with the pathogens responsible for typhoid fever, cholera, dysentery, and hepatitis A. Your sterile stomach, protected by modern water treatment and pasteurization, possesses no defense against these invaders. Within 12 hours of drinking untreated 1st century water, you would experience violent cramping. Within 24 hours, bloody diarrhea and fever. Within 48 hours, severe dehydration leading to shock, kidney failure, and death. The biblical admonition to drink wine was not spiritual advice. It was a survival strategy. The fermentation process and alcohol content made wine somewhat safer than raw water, but even wine carried risks. It was typically diluted 3 parts water to 1 part wine, meaning you were still consuming contaminated water, and the wine itself was often stored in pottery vessels that leached lead, a heavy metal that accumulates in the body, causing neurological damage, kidney failure, and ultimately death. But let's move beyond bread and water to what should have been the safest food source: fish. The Sea of Galilee teemed with fish, and multiple gospel accounts describe Jesus eating fish with his disciples. Surely fresh-caught fish was safe? Not even remotely. The challenge began the moment a fish left the water. In 90-degree heat with no ice, bacterial growth is exponential. Within 2 hours, fish flesh becomes a breeding ground for Vibrio, Salmonella, and Staphylococcus aureus. The preservation methods available were crude and dangerous. Salting was most common. Fish were layered in ceramic jars with massive quantities of salt. The sodium content would be astronomical by modern standards, easily 20-30 times what we consume today. For a 1st century laborer sweating profusely under the sun, this was tolerable. For you, with your modern diet and blood pressure, consuming this level of salt would cause immediate hypertension, severe edema, and potentially fatal strain on your kidneys and heart. Then there was the fermented fish sauce called garum, a delicacy throughout the Roman Empire made by fermenting fish intestines, blood, and flesh in the sun for months until it liquefied into a pungent brown sauce. The smell alone would make most modern people vomit. But the real danger lay in the fermentation process, which could produce botulinum toxin, one of the most lethal substances known to biology. A single teaspoon of improperly fermented garum could paralyze your respiratory system within hours. And it was precisely at this point that the danger escalated beyond food itself to the vessels used to prepare and serve it. In wealthier households, and remember, even the relatively prosperous like Matthew the tax collector or Zacchaeus were considered traders, food was cooked in bronze or copper cauldrons. These metals react violently with acidic foods. When you cook a stew containing wine, vinegar, or tomatoes, no tomatoes in 1st century Judea, those came from the New World, the acid leaches copper ions into the food. Acute copper poisoning causes vomiting, diarrhea, and abdominal pain that feels like knives twisting in your gut. Chronic exposure leads to liver cirrhosis and kidney failure. But copper was expensive. Most common people cooked in cheaper pottery vessels glazed with lead-based compounds. Every meal leached neurotoxic lead into the food. Archaeological analysis of bones from this period shows lead levels that would be considered severe poisoning by modern medical standards. The Jewish population had adapted somewhat, but your nervous system would deteriorate rapidly. Confusion, tremors, seizures, coma. But there was an even more insidious threat that few modern people consider: parasites. In an agricultural society where human waste was the primary fertilizer, parasite infection was nearly universal. Vegetables, lettuce, cucumbers, leeks, were grown in soil enriched with night soil, human feces. These crops were then eaten raw or lightly cooked, their surfaces crawling with invisible eggs of roundworms, tapeworms, and liver flukes. Once inside your digestive system, these parasites would hatch and begin their life cycle. Roundworms can grow to 12 inches long, forming tangled masses that block intestines. Tapeworms attach to your intestinal wall and steal nutrients, growing to 20 feet in length while you slowly starve. Liver flukes migrate to your bile ducts, causing jaundice, liver abscesses, and excruciating pain. Modern populations have almost no exposure to these parasites, meaning your immune system wouldn't recognize them as threats until they'd already caused irreversible damage. And here's where the biblical narrative becomes medically illuminating. When Jesus speaks in Matthew 15:11 saying, "It is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth," he was challenging not just Pharisaic tradition, but addressing a population obsessed with food purity for survival reasons. The elaborate Mosaic food laws, no pork, no shellfish, specific preparation methods, were not arbitrary religious rules, but divinely inspired public health regulations. Pork in that climate was a death sentence. Trichinella spiralis, the roundworm that causes trichinosis, forms cysts in pig muscle that survive cooking at low temperatures. Eating undercooked pork leads to muscle pain, fever, facial swelling, and in severe cases, heart failure and encephalitis. Shellfish, which filter dozens of gallons of water daily, concentrate bacteria, viruses, and toxins. A single contaminated oyster could kill you with Vibrio vulnificus, a flesh-eating bacterium that causes a 50% mortality rate even with modern antibiotics. The genius of Levitical law was its protection of a population that had no microscopes, no germ theory, no antibiotics. God gave them rules they could follow without understanding the invisible reasons, and those who followed these laws survived at higher rates than surrounding Gentile populations. But here's the paradox. Even following every food law perfectly, even eating only kosher food prepared with ritual cleanliness, a modern person would still face dangers that first-century Jews had adapted to over generations. Consider dairy. Milk was rare, a luxury reserved for children and the sick. But when available, it was consumed raw, immediately after milking, because there was no preservation method. Raw milk is a bacterial cocktail: Listeria, E. coli, Salmonella, Campylobacter, Brucella. First-century bodies had developed some tolerance. Your body has none. A single cup of raw goat's milk could give you brucellosis, a disease causing recurring fevers, joint pain, and potentially fatal complications affecting the heart and brain. Cheese was somewhat safer because the fermentation process killed some pathogens, but it was typically made in unsanitary conditions and aged in caves where it absorbed molds, not the cultivated Penicillium roqueforti of blue cheese, but wild molds including species that produce aflatoxins, among the most carcinogenic substances known. Even honey, which we think of as naturally antibacterial, posed risks. Wild honey could contain granotoxins from rhododendron or oleander pollen, causing mad honey disease, cardiac arrhythmias, severe drops in blood pressure, and hallucinations. But beyond the immediate biological threats, there was the grinding reality of malnutrition that would erode your health day by day. The first-century diet was extremely seasonal and monotonous. In late winter and early spring, the hungry months, fresh produce disappeared entirely. The diet consisted of stored grain, dried legumes, and little else. Vitamin C deficiency would begin within weeks. Scurvy starts subtly, fatigue, joint pain, easy bruising. Then your gums bleed and rot, old wounds reopen, and lethargy becomes profound as your collagen breaks down. Vitamin A deficiency from lack of fresh vegetables leads to night blindness, a condition so common it's mentioned in ancient texts. B vitamin deficiencies cause beriberi and pellagra, diseases producing dementia, skin lesions, diarrhea, and death. Ironically, the wealthy suffered too, but from opposite problems. The elite who could afford meat daily suffered from gout, painful crystallized uric acid in joints. Sugar, imported at enormous expense, rotted teeth, and caused metabolic disorders. The medical philosophy of the time made matters worse. Influenced by Greek humoral theory, physicians believed in balancing the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Raw fruits and vegetables were considered cold and moist, supposedly promoting putrefaction in the stomach. Therefore, almost everything was boiled until nutrients were destroyed. Anyone asking for fresh fruit would be warned they were courting illness, and ironically, they were right to worry, because raw produce fertilized with human waste was indeed dangerous. And it was exactly there that everything changed when Jesus began his ministry. His miracles involving food weren't just displays of divine power, they were merciful interventions in a daily struggle for survival. When he multiplied loaves and fishes to feed 5,000, he wasn't just satisfying hunger, he was providing safe, blessed food to people who faced poisoning with every meal. When he turned water into wine at Cana, he was transforming dangerous water into a safer beverage while elevating a wedding celebration. When he ate with tax collectors and sinners, breaking bread with ritually unclean people, he was demonstrating that relationship with God transcends the food laws that, while protective, were never meant to be barriers to divine love. And when he instituted the Eucharist, taking bread and wine, the most fundamental elements of survival in that world, and declaring them his body and blood, he was transforming the daily act of eating from mere biological necessity into spiritual communion. Consider the profound symbolism. Bread, which could harbor so many dangers, becomes the body of Christ, perfectly safe, spiritually nourishing, life-giving. Wine, which in its ancient form was somewhat safer than water, but still carried risks, becomes the blood of Christ, the true source of life. The same Jesus who said, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger," John 6:35, was speaking to people who understood hunger not as inconvenience, but as the daily threat of death. No one could predict what would come next in that dinner in the upper room. But Jesus knew. He knew that within hours he would face crucifixion. He knew his disciples would scatter. And yet, in that moment, he focused on something as ordinary and yet as essential as sharing a meal. Because meals in that culture weren't just about nutrition, they were about covenant, about community, about the sacred act of sustaining life together. To eat with someone was to declare kinship, to share life itself with all its dangers and blessings. When we observe the food culture of Jesus' time through modern eyes, we realize that survival itself was a daily miracle. The Jewish people weren't just spiritually chosen, they were biologically adapted through centuries of selective pressure. Those whose immune systems couldn't handle the bacterial load died young. Those whose livers couldn't process heavy metals never reproduced. Those susceptible to parasites didn't survive to adulthood. What remained was a hardy population that could endure conditions that would hospitalize us within hours. But here's the deepest truth. God worked through these harsh realities, not despite them. The food laws of Leviticus weren't primitive superstition. They were divinely revealed public health measures, protecting a people who had no scientific understanding of why they worked. The emphasis on hospitality, on sharing meals, on communal eating wasn't just cultural preference, it was a survival strategy ensuring no one faced the dangers of food alone. The elaborate hand-washing rituals before meals weren't about spiritual purity alone, they actually did reduce disease transmission. And when Jesus declared all foods clean in Mark 7:19, he wasn't being reckless with public health. He was announcing that the new covenant would transcend geographical and dietary boundaries, that the gospel would spread to Gentile nations with different food systems, that the kingdom of God was not limited to those who could perfectly observe Levitical law. He was preparing his followers for a mission that would take them to Rome, to Greece, to the ends of the earth, where they would eat whatever was set before them. The same God who sustained the Israelites with manna in the wilderness, bread from heaven that appeared each morning, perfectly safe, requiring no preservation, continued to sustain his people through dangerous times with dangerous food. And he continues today, though our dangers have changed. We no longer fear ergot poisoning or parasitic worms, but we face processed foods filled with chemicals, factory farming that breeds antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and abundance so extreme it causes diseases of excess unknown to the ancient world. Perhaps the lesson for us is this: in every age, food is both life and death, blessing and curse, depending on how we approach it. The people of Jesus' time ate every meal with awareness that it might sicken them, yet they gave thanks before breaking bread. They drank wine knowing it might contain lead, yet they blessed the cup. They couldn't control the dangers, so they entrusted themselves to God's providence. We, with all our food safety regulations and refrigeration and antibiotics, have forgotten that fundamental dependence. And if this documentary strengthened your faith, if it helped you see the Gospels not as sanitized religious texts, but as gritty, dangerous, real accounts of God entering into the mess and risk of human existence, then take a moment to reflect on your next meal. Before you bite into bread, remember that you're participating in a ritual older than civilization itself. And if you're a Christian, remember that when Jesus said, "Do this in remembrance of me," he was linking the most dangerous necessity of ancient life, eating, with the safest reality of eternity, his sacrificial love. If this changed how you read the Bible, click like and share this documentary. Leave a comment telling us what surprised you most. And remember, the same God who preserved his people through lead-laden pottery and parasite-infested vegetables preserves you today through different dangers. His providence hasn't changed, only the context has. Until the next video, and may God bless you.